Have you ever wondered why some men, the ones who promise to love you most, are the first to make you feel small in your own home? It was a Tuesday night when he did it. No yelling, no big argument, just a cold, deliberate sentence thrown over his shoulder like it meant nothing. "You can sleep on the couch tonight." He didn't even look at her. He just walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, as if each step was a reminder that he owned the space between them. The couch, old, stiff, and faintly smelling of dust, waited for her like a punishment. And she, quiet as always, obeyed, but not because she accepted it. You see, there's a certain kind of silence that isn't submission, it's calculation. She wrapped herself in the scratchy throw blanket, her eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. That's when she began to think, really think, about how many nights she had gone to bed with her voice swallowed, about how many little humiliations she'd filed away because it wasn't worth the fight. You might think this was about one petty argument. No. This was about a pattern, a slow erosion of respect so subtle that she almost didn't notice when the floor beneath her finally crumbled. In the morning, she made him breakfast. Yes, she did. Eggs, coffee, the toast, just the way he liked it. You might ask why feed someone who had just shoved you emotionally to the margins of your own home? That's the thing. Sometimes you have to play the part just long enough for them to believe you're still in the same script. She smiled, asked about his day, kissed his cheek as if the night before had been nothing. And he believed her. But beneath that smile, something in her was sharpening, like a blade, slow and deliberate. That weekend, she started moving things, not big things, just little ones. His favorite mug disappeared into the back of the cupboard. The charger he always used got quietly swapped for one that barely worked, his socks mysteriously unmatched. He didn't notice at first. They never do. When he finally did, he called her forgetful. She just laughed, that quiet, knowing laugh that isn't an apology. He didn't realize it yet, but the balance had already begun to shift. And here's where most women make the mistake: they confront too soon, shout too early, tip their hand before the game's done. Not her. She waited. She watched him get comfortable again, certain that she'd accepted her place. Then, on a Sunday morning, he woke up to find his bag already packed by the door. Not hers, his. She had booked him a week in a motel, the cheapest one she could find that still offered free Wi-Fi. She told him, in a voice so calm it cut deeper than any scream, "You'll sleep there." Think of it as perspective. Do you feel it? That shift, that quiet reversal where the one who was once pushed to the couch now holds the keys to the entire house. He stared at her like she'd just spoken another language. In his mind, this wasn't how the story was supposed to go. He was the one who made the rules, but now she was the one standing by the door watching him carry his own suitcase out. And she didn't slam the door behind him. No, she closed it gently, because she knew. The loudest power isn't in the shout. It's in the whisper that follows. Some might say she overreacted. Others might call it justice. But let me ask you, how many times can a person erase you in small ways before you take back the pen and rewrite the ending yourself? He would call later, of course. First with confusion, then with anger, then with a strange, desperate softness. But each time her phone lit up, she let it ring. She was busy making herself coffee, opening the curtains wide, breathing in the air of a home that finally felt like hers again. Because once you've been sent to the couch and you survive it without breaking, you realize something dangerous: you can survive without them entirely. He learned that motel curtains are heavy, that they smell like old shampoo, and the kind of loneliness that gets in your hair. The first night, he lay on polyester sheets, hearing the ice machine cough down the hall, and he tried to tell himself this was just a pause, a punishment with an expiration date. He pictured her with her gentle voice, the one he had always mistaken for weakness, and he told himself she would cave. She did not cave. She opened windows the whole way, let the house breathe. She stripped the couch of its blanket, washed it until the water ran clear, and then folded it neatly at the foot of their bed like an artifact under glass. Remember this. Remember what was done here. You might wonder how a woman like her, the one who always apologized, first changes shape overnight. You should know it was not overnight. It was a long apprenticeship in silence. She grew up in a kitchen where the quiet mother poured tea and kept the peace with her eyes. She watched the golden daughter glide through rooms, adored for shining, not for standing. And she learned the role of the shadow wife before she ever married the one who keeps everything running while being told she is lucky to be included at all. Does that sting a little when you recognize your own reflection in it? He texted on day 2, a photo of the motel TV and a half joke about the remote not working. She looked at it, then set the phone face down. You, reader, might have answered, You might have added a laughing emoji, a truce disguised as humor. But sometimes the most dangerous kindness is the one you withhold. She made tea, held the warm mug to her lips, and allowed the quiet to expand between them like a room with no furniture, where every footstep echoed truth. She went through drawers, not to snoop but to reclaim territory. The house had become a museum to his preferences. His spices lined up with militant neatness. His hobby tools spread over the dining table like a claim flag. She cleared one half of the table and put fresh flowers there, small white ones that looked fragile and held up under rain. The first night he had sent her to the couch, the flowers on the table had been fake. Now they were not. If you were sitting with her, you would have noticed the way she moved slower, more deliberate. She folded laundry in perfect rectangles. She labeled a shelf in the fridge with her name, a tiny act of sovereignty that looks silly until you recognize it is a flag on the moon. She changed the Wi-Fi password to a phrase only she would remember. He called that night and left a voicemail a little sharper. Did she really change the password? That was petty. He laughed when he said petty, but the laugh broke halfway through and became something small. She listened to the voicemail once, then she pressed delete and felt the click travel down her spine like a zip closing. There had been signs, of course. The time he corrected her story in front of his friends changed her memory to fit his punchline. The time he rolled his eyes when she cried, said she was doing it again, playing the victim card as if her pain was a deck he could reshuffle. The time he brushed past her in the kitchen, took the last clean plate, and said over his shoulder that she would get to the dishes later, he was sure. None of this is dramatic enough for a courtroom. All of it matters. On day 3, she drove to the motel with a small bag, toiletries he preferred, a clean shirt. She walked past the flickering neon sign past the front desk, where a woman watched her with the tired empathy of someone who has seen too many different versions of the same story. She knocked, and he opened the door in socks and a television glow. For a second, he looked like a boy who had been sent to stand in the hallway. "I brought your stuff," she said, and placed the bag on the dresser. He reached for her wrist reflex more than thought, and she stepped back like the air had a boundary line now. "You made your point," he said, trying for charm and landing near something brittle. "Come on, come home." You have said these words or heard them. You know the pull of the familiar even when it hurts. The way your body moves toward the known, out of habit, not love. She felt it, that old stitching tug. Then she breathed and the thread loosened. "I set some terms," she said. "If you want to come back, you will agree to therapy. You will stop speaking to me like I am a problem you were assigned, and you will never send me to a couch again." He blinked. The rules had always been his. Now she said the word terms like she had discovered a new language, and it tasted like iron and honey. "You cannot be serious," he said, "over a couch." It was never over a couch. You know this. It was over 1,000 small surrenders that had left her voice hoarse in her own mouth. She left the bag. She left him with the hum of the minibar and the taste of his own name when he said it out loud to an empty room. She drove home and sat in the driveway for a full minute with both hands on the wheel, tears cooling on her cheekbones like rain that finally reached ground after hanging in the air too long. Inside, she wrote the terms on a piece of paper and taped it to the refrigerator where the spices used to stand like soldiers. She wrote a second note and slid it into her own pocket. You would want to know what it said. It said simply, "I believe myself." Day 4. The motel room had begun to feel like a box with his own breathing trapped inside it. The TV rattled the same news loop, the ice bucket sat empty, and the carpet smelled faintly of other people's apologies. He told himself she'd call by now, or at least soften. He imagined her pacing, missing him, replaying the night he'd sent her to the couch, and convincing herself it wasn't that bad. She wasn't pacing. She was humming. There was music in the kitchen again, something soft and steady. She opened all the blinds so the morning light spilled across the floorboards like a new coat of paint. She cooked breakfast for herself, plated it beautifully, and ate it in silence. Not the tense silence of waiting for a door to open, but the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts without interruption. Do you know how dangerous that kind of silence can be for someone who's always been told who they are? Once you start hearing your own voice clearly, the other voice, the one that's been narrating your worth for you, starts to sound foreign. He called that afternoon, and this time she picked up. Not because she missed him, but because she was curious how far he'd bend before he broke. His voice was lighter than she expected, but she could hear the gravel underneath. "I've been thinking," he began, which usually meant he was going to explain why she had overreacted. But she didn't give him the opening. "Have you read the terms?" she asked. He hesitated, then laughed. You tape them to the fridge like I'm a teenager on probation. You are, she said, voice like still water. Only difference is you can choose not to come back. That landed. She heard the pause, the soft click in his mind when he realized this wasn't a performance, and it rattled him because control isn't really about shouting, it's about predictability. He had always been able to predict her. Now she was an unknown variable. You've seen this, haven't you? The moment someone realizes the person they thought would always be there might actually walk, it's like watching a building sway when you thought the foundations were made of stone. That night she found herself remembering the early days. How he used to bring her coffee in bed. How he'd rest his hand on the small of her back in public like it was a promise. But nostalgia can be dangerous. It edits out the parts you don't want to see. She forced herself to remember, too, the first time he'd mocked her in front of someone else. The way he'd told her she was too sensitive when she didn't laugh. The night he'd turned his back mid-sentence and said he was too tired to hear her drama. It wasn't just the couch. It was the slow, steady teaching that her comfort was negotiable, and he was the negotiator. On day 5, she went to the closet and began sorting. She moved his suits to one side, stacked his shoes neatly, and left a single suitcase open on the floor. Not packed, just open, waiting. The message was clear: this house will not absorb you by default anymore. You are here by agreement, not assumption. That evening he showed up at the door without calling. She opened it but didn't step aside. He looked tired, hair unkempt, like the motel had been draining him in slow sips. I'm not staying there another night, he said. It's ridiculous. She didn't answer. She just let the silence stretch until he shifted his weight like the floor had become unsteady. I'll do the therapy, he added, finally almost spitting the words out. If that's what it takes. Her eyes stayed on his unblinking. And the couch. He flinched. I won't. He stopped, swallowed, then tried again. I won't treat you like that again. Do you believe him? She didn't, not fully. But she believed in her own ability to enforce the terms now, and that was enough. She stepped aside slowly, like she was allowing a guest into her home. Inside, he noticed small changes. The flowers, the clear half of the table, the absence of his clutter where it used to sprawl unchecked. It didn't look like the same space he'd left, and that unsettled him more than the motel ever could. He sat on the edge of the couch, her couch, and for the first time he looked like he wasn't sure if he belonged there. That's the thing they never tell you about power shifts. Sometimes the most devastating blow isn't exile, it's return. Because now he had to live with the fact that she had imagined life without him, and she had liked what she saw. That first night back, he didn't sleep well. Not because the bed was uncomfortable, it never was, but because the house felt different. The air had weight now, like it was holding its breath. Every creak in the floorboards seemed to remind him of the week he spent at the motel, where the hum of the vending machine had been his only companion. She, on the other hand, slept deeply, her breathing slow and steady. She didn't check whether he was watching her in the dark. She didn't need to. She knew he was. That's the thing about shifting power, you don't have to announce it every time. The other person feels it even when you say nothing. In the morning, she didn't make him coffee. She didn't say good morning either. She moved through the kitchen like a woman in her own home because she was, and he sat at the table waiting for her to acknowledge him. She didn't. And if you've ever been ignored by someone whose attention you once took for granted, you know it cuts deeper than any argument. He tried to slip back into old rhythms. Jokes over breakfast, little touches as he passed behind her. But she didn't lean into them like before. She stood a fraction straighter, kept her eyes on whatever she was doing. Every time he reached for something, she made him feel like he was reaching into a space he didn't own anymore. You see, once a person understands that your comfort is not a given, every interaction becomes a negotiation. He was learning that now, slowly, painfully. On day 2 of his return, he brought her flowers. The same ones he'd given her years ago when he'd first asked her out. Once they would have made her blush. Now she simply placed them in a vase, set them on the far end of the counter, and went back to her work. Not cold, not cruel, just unshaken. He didn't understand that the point wasn't forgiveness, it was redefinition. She wasn't going to erase what happened. She was going to make sure it could never happen again. And that meant she had to let the imbalance sit there between them exposed until he learned how to live without tipping it back in his favor. That night they sat across from each other on the couch, the same couch. She didn't avoid it, didn't treat it like a battlefield. No. She leaned back comfortably, remote in hand, while he seemed almost afraid to sink into the cushions. He glanced at her, then at the space beside her, like he was asking for permission without saying the words. She didn't give it. She just kept watching the screen. Do you know what that does to a man who's built his power on quiet control? It unravels him from the inside. Because now every move requires awareness, every word requires care. He had to think before speaking, measure before touching, and she finally had the space to think about what she wanted, not just how to keep the peace. By the weekend, he brought up therapy again. "I'll schedule it," he said, as if it were a concession he was magnanimously offering. She just nodded like she'd heard him say he might pick up milk on the way home. That was the moment he realized this wasn't going to be a simple return to normal. And here's what you need to understand: she didn't want revenge. Revenge still ties you to the person who hurt you. She wanted freedom. She wanted to know she could look at him and see a man she chose to keep, not one she was afraid to lose. On Sunday morning, he found her sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook open. She was writing something in slow, deliberate strokes. He asked what it was. She closed the cover before he could see. "It's my list," she said, "of things I will never tolerate again." He didn't ask if he was on it. Some truths don't need to be spoken out loud to be understood. That night, as they got into bed, she turned off her lamp before he did. She faced away from him, eyes open in the dark, and smiled faintly. Not because she had won, because she had changed the game entirely, and somewhere inside him he knew it too. By the second week, the rhythm of the house had become foreign to him. It wasn't hostile, no slammed doors, no shouted arguments, but it was unfamiliar in a way that kept him unsettled. Before her world had revolved around him in small, invisible ways, she would wait for him to choose the TV show, adjust dinner to his preferences, without being asked, pause her own tasks when he started talking. Now, the orbit was broken. She moved on her own axis and he was left circling, trying to find the gravity again. One morning he walked into the kitchen to find her reading at the table with her coffee hair still wet from a shower, sunlight catching on the rim of her cup. There was something unbothered in her posture. He realized she hadn't asked him about his plans in days. She wasn't tracking him anymore, wasn't tending to the edges of his life like she used to. And that absence felt louder than any confrontation. Have you ever been treated like a guest in a place where you were once king? It's a strange kind of humiliation, one that forces you to see how much of your power depended on someone else's constant consent. He tried a different tactic, charm. He suggested a dinner out somewhere nice, just us like old times. She smiled politely and said she already had plans. He didn't ask with who. He didn't want to know. But the way she said it, calm, factual, without apology, made his chest tighten. That evening he searched for the old cues she used to give him those little signs she was open to him again. But they weren't there. She was pleasant, but untouchable. It was the pleasantness that unnerved him most. There's no foothold in someone who no longer needs your approval to breathe. She had started using the word "I" more. "I'm going for a walk. I'm thinking about repainting the bedroom. I'm going to call a lawyer to look over the mortgage." The last one landed like a stone dropped in water. He didn't even know she had a lawyer. She didn't explain, and he didn't ask. You might think she was bluffing, that maybe she just wanted to scare him into shape. But here's the truth: she was done playing at threats. Every statement was now an action in motion. She'd learned the quiet cruelty of follow-through. On day 11, he came home to find his suitcase still empty, moved from the closet to the corner of the bedroom. Not in the way you move something to get it out of the way, but in the way you place something where it will be seen. He opened his mouth to say something, but she was on the phone in the next room laughing at something someone said. He didn't interrupt. That night she sat at the dining table with a pen and her notebook again. He watched her from the couch, the same couch that had started all of this. He'd stopped sitting on it with the same ease. It was no longer neutral territory. It was a monument now, a reminder. "Are you writing your list again?" he asked, half joking. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm adding to it." He laughed, but it was hollow. "Do I get to see what's on it?" "No," she said. "You get to notice." Do you feel that? The way the air changes when someone refuses to explain themselves to you anymore? That's when you realize they've stopped treating you as the audience for their life, and that's the first step towards you no longer being in the story at all. By the weekend, she had painted the bedroom a pale, clean color that reflected more light. He hadn't been consulted. When he asked why she didn't wait for his input, she just said, "Because I wanted it done." Something in him began to panic. Not the loud, flailing panic, but the slow one, the kind that creeps in when you start imagining the day they tell you with steady eyes that you don't live here anymore. He'd never thought she could be that person. Now he wasn't so sure. And that night, lying in bed beside her, he realized the motel hadn't been the punishment. The real punishment was this coming home and finding that it wasn't his home anymore. By week 3, he had stopped pretending not to notice the shifts. The changes weren't just in her, they were in the air, in the furniture, in the way sound traveled through the house. The walls no longer seemed to hold his voice the way they once did. Conversations didn't linger, they just ended, and she went on with her day. She had started locking the bathroom door. He'd never realized she hadn't before. It was such a small thing, but it carried a message so sharp he felt it in his bones. There were parts of her life that were no longer accessible to him, no matter how long they had shared a bed. Have you ever tried to re-enter a room you once owned only to find the locks had been changed while you were gone? That's what it felt like for him. Only the locks were invisible and they were everywhere. On a Tuesday evening, she announced without looking up from her laptop that she had enrolled in an evening art class. He opened his mouth to ask, went to suggest he could drive her, but she was already sending an email, her focus elsewhere. "I'll take my own car," she added, as if she'd heard his thought before it reached his lips. The next day he came home to find a new shelf installed in the living room. On it, framed photos of her with friends he didn't know well, smiling in places he had never been. For the first time, he realized there were parts of her life he had no memory of, whole moments she'd lived without him. That scared him more than any fight they'd ever had. You see, when you've built your confidence on being the center of someone's world, their independence doesn't just unsettle you, it erases the very stage you've been standing on. That night, he finally asked, "Are you happy?" It was supposed to sound casual, but it came out low and tight, like the question had been caught in his throat for days. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Happier than I was." He didn't ask when. He knew the answer. She went to her art class that Thursday, came home late, smelling faintly of turpentine and cold air. She didn't tell him what she painted. He didn't ask. He told himself it was because he didn't care, but the truth sat heavier. He was afraid the painting wouldn't include him at all. On Friday, she cleared a drawer in the hallway for her own things. "Only mine," she said when he asked if he could put anything there. The drawer itself was nothing special, just wood and metal sliders, but the claim was unmistakable. She was carving out space, and not just in the furniture. By Saturday, his old certainty was gone. He used to believe that no matter what, she would meet him halfway, bridge the gap, smooth over the cracks. Now she stood at her own side of the gap and watched to see if he'd make the effort. He tried. He washed the dishes without being asked. He folded laundry even the way she preferred, but every gesture felt like it came too late, like arriving at the station to find the train already gone. That night, as they sat across from each other at dinner, he noticed she was wearing a ring he didn't recognize, simple, silver, elegant. "When did you get that?" he asked. "Last week," she said, spearing a piece of roasted vegetable with her fork. "You didn't tell me." "It wasn't for you," she replied. "Do you feel that sting? The sudden awareness that you are no longer the intended audience for their joy?" That was the moment he knew she wasn't bluffing about anything. Not the terms, not the changes, not the possibility of a life without him. Later that night, he dreamed of the motel. Not the bed or the curtains, just the door, and how heavy it had felt when it closed behind him. He woke with the realization that the door at home could feel the same way any day now. And as he lay there watching her sleep, he finally understood she didn't need to send him back to the motel. The possibility alone was enough to keep him in check. By the 4th week, the tension had taken on a quieter shape, no longer the sharp edge of confrontation, but the steady hum of a house that didn't belong entirely to him anymore. She moved through it like she was curating her own life piece by piece, and he moved like a visitor, careful not to touch what wasn't his. She had started going out more. Sometimes she mentioned where dinners with friends, late-night coffee after class, but sometimes she didn't. She'd leave with a casual, "Don't wait up," and there was nothing in her tone for him to grip onto. No guilt, no hesitation, just the simple fact of her autonomy. Do you know how maddening that is for someone who once believed your time was theirs to schedule? It's like watching a bird you thought was tame take off without looking back. One evening, he came home early and found her in the living room, music playing low, surrounded by canvases. Some were abstract swirls of color. Others were sharp, deliberate lines. One painting stopped him, a deep, moody piece where a figure stood in the center of a room facing a closed door. "Is that me?" he asked, half laughing, half afraid. She glanced at it. "It's whoever sees themselves in it." The words hung there, a subtle blade. He wanted to press her demand and answer, but he could feel how dangerous it would be to turn that into a fight. Instead, he nodded as if he understood. Later that week, he noticed the suitcase again, still in the corner of the bedroom, still open, still empty. It was never mentioned. It didn't need to be. It was both a warning and an invitation. Stay if you can live by the new rules. Leave if you can't. He began treading lightly, careful with his words. Even his jokes came slower now, as if he were testing the air first. He found himself remembering all the little dismissals he used to toss her way the way he'd brushed off her feelings because they weren't convenient. He thought of the night he'd sent her to the couch and realized with a sick twist in his gut that it had been the turning point, the moment she'd stopped trying to protect the version of him she thought he could be. By now she no longer reacted to his small attempts at charm. Compliments landed with a polite thank you. Offers to help were met with I've already done it. She didn't need him to fail to make her point. She just needed him to see she could thrive without him. You might think that kind of confidence would make him fight harder to win her back, but there's another truth sometimes: it makes a person retreat. Not out of pride, but because they can feel the ledger tipping, and they're afraid to see just how far they've fallen in your estimation. One Friday night, she came home later than usual. She kicked off her shoes at the door, humming, cheeks flushed from the cold. He was sitting on the couch, the same couch, waiting. "Where were you?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "With people who value my company," she said simply, walking past him toward the kitchen. That answer was a splinter under his skin. Not because she'd said it to hurt him, but because she believed it fully, and it left no space for his rebuttal. The next day, he tried one last gesture, made her breakfast cleaned. The kitchen even brought in fresh flowers. She smiled, said, "That's nice," and went back to reading. The distance between them wasn't measured in arguments anymore. It was measured in how little his efforts could shift her center of gravity. That night, as they got into bed, she didn't turn away from him like she had in the past few weeks. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. After a long silence, she said, "If you ever send me to the couch again, you won't have to worry about where I sleep. You won't be here to see it." He didn't answer. He knew there was nothing to say. And somewhere in the quiet, he realized the motel had been a lesson, but this right now was the sentence. By the 5th week, the house had settled into a strange equilibrium, one where she moved with ease and he moved with caution. It wasn't war anymore. It was something colder, something more permanent. She began making subtle changes, the kind that claimed the space without announcing it. A new quilt on the bed, soft and textured one he hadn't chosen. The bookshelf rearranged so her favorite novels were front-facing, their spines like quiet declarations. Even the scent of the house had shifted. She burned candles in warm, grounding scents instead of the citrus ones he liked. None of these things were big enough to provoke an argument, but together they told the story of someone taking ownership. You might not notice those details if you visited, but he noticed. Every single one. And the more he noticed, the more he realized how little of the house now reflected him. One evening, she was sitting at the dining table with her laptop working on something she didn't explain. He hovered in the doorway, wanting to ask what she was doing, but the words stuck. He'd learned that every question now came with the risk of an answer he didn't want, or worse, no answer at all. She closed the laptop and looked up at him. "We need to talk," she said. He felt his pulse spike. That phrase had never ended well. "I've been thinking about what I want this house to feel like," she continued, "and what I want my life to feel like." He stayed silent, afraid to interrupt. "I'm not interested in going back to how things were," she said. "That version of us is gone. If you're here, it's because you want to be in this new version. And if you can't," she let the sentence hang unfinished. The suitcase in the corner was the punctuation. "Do you feel that kind of ultimatum, the one where you're not being begged to change but simply informed of the terms? That's when you know the other person has already made peace with losing you." He nodded, but it wasn't agreement, it was buying time. Time to figure out if he could live with a version of her who didn't center him in every decision. That weekend, she hosted friends for dinner. Friends he barely knew, people she'd met through her art class. He watched her move easily among them, laughing, telling stories completely at home in her own skin. No glances toward him for approval, no quiet checking if he was comfortable. She didn't need him to anchor the evening, she was the anchor. After they left, he said, "You seemed happy tonight." "I was," she replied, and left it there. In the days that followed, he tried to imagine the night he'd sent her to the couch from her perspective. He pictured her lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, something inside her quietly shifting. And for the first time he realized it wasn't that night that had broken her. It was all the nights before, the tiny cuts that had been too easy to ignore until they formed a wound that wouldn't close. By now the motel felt like a memory from someone else's life. But the lesson it carried was still sharp. If you can send someone away from their own bed, you're telling them the house isn't theirs. And if they believe you, even for one night, they'll start building a place where you're not welcome either. One night, as they lay in bed, she spoke softly into the dark. "You know, the couch wasn't the worst part." He turned to face her. What was? The way you didn't even look back, she said, like I was already gone. He wanted to tell her that wasn't true, that he'd been angry that he hadn't thought. But in that moment, he understood that the explanation didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd felt disposable, and she'd decided she never would again. She rolled over her back to him, and he stared at the ceiling. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. It was final. And in that stillness, he understood something he wished he'd known sooner. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.